here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arash's World. Today, we have a very special guest. We have Stephen Edwards. Hello, welcome to Arash's World.
Good morning, Ross. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So briefly, how would you describe yourself? Because you got many talents. So I'd really like to know how you would describe yourself here briefly.
Multi-hyphenate.
Exactly.
I do a lot of different things. I really started off as a keyboardist, a pianist. And back in the 90s, got into writing original music for visual media, for mostly movies and TV shows. So I've been doing that pretty much ever since. And then in my 50s, decided I wanted to, direct documentary films. I made a film called Requiem for My Mother, which was about my late mother, about a piece of music that I wrote in honor of her when she passed away in 2004. And she was a choir director. And it turns out the movie took place in Vatican City because the choir flew to Rome to perform this piece, long story short. And also in the middle of that, I became a citizen of Italy because my late mother was Sicilian. And so then this story sort of fell into my lap completely by mistake, almost happenstance, serendipity. I saw a Facebook post about it and I was fascinated. And the first thing I said was, oh, I want to watch that documentary. So I went to Hulu, Netflix, Amazon, sort of all the usual suspects. And I said, oh, this film's going to be somewhere. I'm going to watch it. It looks fascinating. It takes place in Rome. And there was nothing. I couldn't believe it. And literally in a span of a minute, made a life decision to make this film myself.
Yeah, and good thing you did. Syndrome K we're talking about. It's a fascinating, moving, uplifting, also inspiring documentary. So how would you describe it? I have 3 doctors try to preserve life no matter what the cost. That's my brief definition of it. But let's go into detail about it. It's because it is quite thrilling. And I had never heard of this before previously. So I wonder if that's common, like, and why, but let's get into it. Yeah.
Well, it's extremely common that no one's heard the story before. This is one of those World War II secret stories. And this takes place in Rome in the Jewish ghetto, which is right kind of in the city center of Rome. It's been there for 2,000 years. And we actually went to the Jewish ghetto and filmed some survivors. And we talked to elders in the Jewish ghetto that had never heard this story that happened literally in their backyard. So, you come to America and you're, 6,000 miles away. Of course, it's very, very unusual if somebody's heard this story. And it's usually because they saw something about my doc.
It sounds like fiction. So can you explain to our listeners here what Syndrome K is?
Sure.
Yeah.
Syndrome K is a fake disease made up by 3 doctors in a Catholic hospital that saved Roman Jews from being deported to Auschwitz. So it's a fake disease, fake charts, fake symptoms, admitted into the hospital, had a wing. They told the SS they couldn't go in the wing. It was too dangerous. They didn't want to get sick. They didn't want to deport them because they didn't want to put them on trains and get the staff at Auschwitz sick, which is the most twisted thing ever, since usually they mostly immediately killed anybody that went there. But they were scared of it, so they stayed away. And so it was a success for Rus.
And the hospital was the Fate Bene Fratelli, Do Good Brothers. These are Catholic priests who also put their lives in danger to help the Jewish people here. And what I find fascinating is because they knew what they were talking about. So when they created this disease, it makes sense, and it fooled the Germans. And the Nazis are known to be very methodical, very smart. They're systematic. They know things, but they were afraid, and they bought it for the longest time too. They believed it.
They did, and the price for being wrong when you're dealing with the SS is death, pretty much instant. There's a anecdote that I didn't include in my film, but Rome got really desperate during the Nazi occupation, that little 9-month period. It was like a third world country. There was no food. It was just not a fun place to be. And there was an instance where 10 Italian mothers broke into an SS bakery and stole wheat, flour to make bread for their own families. And when the SS found out, they lined them up in front of the Tiber and machine gunned them all.
Oh my God.
So this is what, I use that as an example because this is what would have happened to the staff at the hospital had they found out this ruse. They would have, first of all, taken all the Jews and deported them for sure. and they probably would have killed the entire staff of the hospital. So the danger that they faced every day, it's hard to even imagine now, because when you're living a lie, you have to support the lie. You have to support it with medical evidence. They had Nazi doctors go in and check charts, and the doctors had to make up a convincing story, and the patients had to show convincing symptoms.
One of the most impressive parts was, and I wish you had footage of it, is where they pretend to be sick and they start coughing, right? All the patients. So when the Nazis come in, then they cough. And I think we can really relate to this now with like COVID, because now when we see people coughing, we kind of stay away from them. So the Germans actually were scared of catching that disease, and so it really helped. It was to the benefit of the whole situation that they did,
especially when they said, there's no cure.
Yeah, that's what I think.
And the SS was kind of a notorious. They were sort of OCD, clean feet,
yes.
Right. Look at their uniforms. Yeah. Look at the way they sort of lived their lives. So it definitely, and they thought Jews were dirty anyway. No,
and in a way they thought they're going to die anyway. This is a Jewish disease, so let them, right? And that again helped in this situation. And what I also found very stunning was there was a moment where there was this hand of God. Can you maybe talk about that? Where the Nazis were coming, and the Catholic priests actually had radios. They were like revolutionaries.
Oh yeah, these guys,
the resistance there.
they didn't mess around. I met them in person.
Oh, wonderful.
What I'll tell you about them is, they took no gruff from anybody. And, I always figure them flipping the bird to the Nazis, because I kind of think that's what they did in the period. They just, there was no love lost whatsoever with these guys. And they did whatever they had to do to fool them. They were occupying their town and they were killing their citizens. So anything they could do, they had clandestine radios in the hospital. It was an operational facility that was resistance. Dr. Osicini, the main doctor that I interviewed, that I met in person, was beaten by the Gestapo and still had bruises 75 years later. Something wrong with his ribs. I mean, he had permanent damage from these guys. So but stood up to them and basically beat them at their own game, which I think is just so amazing.
At the same time, they defied orders because they did not check and consult with the Vatican. Is that correct? So they did their own thing.
They did, and there's a lot of speculation about how that actually worked. But there was so many. If you think about the Italian Jews as an entire population, if you take the whole country, there's a statistic like 80% of the Italian Jews survived the Holocaust.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And if you look at Poland and you look at the numbers there, it's hard to even comprehend. I mean, it's millions of people were slaughtered. So Italy did relatively better. And a lot of that has to do with the Italian people saying, look, those are our people, screw you. You can't take them. And if you're going to try to take them, we're going to hide them. There were people hiding in the Pope's castle, Casa Gandolfi, I think it's called. It's where it's basically Camp David for the Pope. So literally in his own residence, there were Jews hiding. So
it's to point out, the hospital is right next to the Jewish ghetto, so that kind of facilitated things to help them and to hide them. But they also falsified documents, which I find, with the seal of the Vatican, which I find again fascinating too. Like the amount of power that the Vatican has comes also to light here within this situation.
And just don't mess with us. And
exactly.
Think about Pope Pius XII, who was the reigning pope during the whole World War II. There he is sitting in the Vatican. He had no army. There was 1,500 SS troops inside the city walls of Rome, which is smaller than downtown LA. The Vatican City is like a 18-hole golf course. It's a tiny little place. And so, he has no army, so he has to fight with other means. And obviously fighting against the best trained, most ruthless soldier ever invented in human history, arguably. Ruthless and capable of atrocities at the blink of a hat, like you and I, eat a bagel, right? It's just, they do stuff that we can't even imagine. So that threat is always ever present. And in spite of that, I talked to plenty of people that said, there were Jewish couples living in seminaries. So the husband would live with the priests and the wife would live with the nuns, right? And they would just, they just wrote it out, So it's amazing what they did and the risk they took.
Yeah. And I was thinking, like, maybe you can explain what the K stands for. My first impression before watching the documentary was Kafka, right?
Right.
But it wasn't.
Well, again, thinking of the Italians flipping the bird at the Nazis,
Yes.
it was definitely to get in their kitchen a little bit, because K stood for Kesslering, who was Hitler's main general, who sent in the occupying forces into Rome, and also Kappler. Kappler was the head of the SS in Rome, a ruthless, basically serial killer who was responsible for a lot of massacres. So it was also, there's a couple of medical terms it was named after. So it was kind of this nebulous K. K isn't really a letter in Italian, apparently. They don't use it very much.
Oh, they don't use it much. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense.
I don't speak the language, so I don't have expertise there. But yeah, so they just gave it this name. But I think it was mostly, a bird flip to Kappler and Kesslering.
Mhm. And I didn't know your background with Italy, that you are a citizen there too. So that kind of gives it also personal dimension to the whole story, and why also you went after this story, which is fascinating on its own. But there's a personal aspect as well too, right?
Absolutely. And just but my family connection. My mother was Sicilian, and my kids actually have red passports too. So it's kind of a cool thing to have. So
Nice.
yeah.
And the score, by the way, is amazing.
Thank
I wonder
you.
who wrote the score.
Well, it's funny, I hired myself,
Yeah.
and I made a joke with the orchestra, and I said, if this music is terrible, I have no one to blame but myself. And my editor, Greg Hunter, I had to bounce stuff off of him, because I'm writing a score for a movie right now while I'm working with the director, and I send him cues, and he says, oh, this part's too emotional, or it's not emotional enough, or it's too tense and I don't want it to be tense. Like, he gives me notes like that, and I basically had to give myself notes.
Were you tough on yourself?
I was.
Yeah.
I threw out my own music on a couple occasions. When sometimes I had to watch the whole thing. I'm like, oh, that cue's too busy, and I'd rewrite it. So I actually did do that several times. And the cool part was, I decided that since it's a World War II story, I integrated world orchestras. So Moscow Symphony plays on our score, Rome, Prague, Belgrade, London, and Hollywood.
Wow, very international.
Oh, yeah. It's really cool. I mean, I figured nobody's ever done it before, and it's going to cost me close to the same if I just hired one orchestra. Let's just do something cool with it and let everybody contribute. So
I also want to look at what's happening right now. I mean, when you made it, that was last year, I believe, documentary. But now this year, COVID was happening at the time, and also Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine. So a lot of the things, this is also very timely in its own way of what it brings to light. And one of the quotes that was mentioned twice, but it's really important, was bravery always wins. And I want to really focus on that in light of what's happening in the world right now.
Isn't it? It's talk about just like sitting in front of Dr. Ozacchini, is sitting across the table from me, and he says that. Yeah. And I don't speak Italian, but I knew what he was saying. Like the passion that guy had. It was so cool sitting in front of him. I've got my picture with him, like, I'm a fanboy, right? Like, I'm meeting Tom Hanks or somebody, and just the sheer guts and will and determination that all of these people had to save people they didn't know, and to risk theirs and their families' lives, and to do it right under the nose of the SS and completely fool them is just, talk about the greatest elevator pitch of all time. 3 doctors make up a fake disease that fool the SS, like the greatest villains in the history of cinema. Got anybody with a swastika, like, forget it, he's the villain. There's no two ways about it. So again, I just couldn't believe that I happened on this story. And here I am in California, 75 years after it happened. And there's still some people that survived that were talking about it that I could talk to.
And the good news is you can't hide these things. Sooner or later, they come out. And we see that throughout history, and many, many things that are happening now. It's like we uncover history and all the bad things as well, the dark side of things that happen, but also uplifting news and information like this one. And your documentary, I really liked also, it gives us the background information with footage, like documentary footage and like news footage and so on. So I was wondering, is there maybe an idea of making a film out of it? Because it would make an excellent film.
100%.
Yeah.
Yes. So we have a script. And we actually have a Zoom call this week with a director who has taken great interest in making this film. So we get a director first, then we get cast, then we get money. It's kind of the way we're doing it. So yes.
Best of luck. I want to see that as well.
Honestly, I made the documentary and I said, the film will be better than the documentary.
Because what was slightly lacking is I'd like to see the patients and how they fool, and just see the faces of the Nazis who fall for it, and the doctors who like lying to them straight into their face and trying not to smile. I'd like to see that.
And the Kapler is the perfect villain.
Yeah,
you can picture what he looks like. What's his name? Richard Burton actually played Kapler in a movie 40 years ago, and was amazing in it. So yeah, I mean, this lends itself to a feature film. I mean, it's a no-brainer. We just got to get the right team in place, and we're going to make the film.
Wonderful. So the documentary,
just the irony of making a documentary about a fake disease in the middle of a pandemic can't be.
I know. That totally resonated with me, and I just like, that's also courageous in its own way. And
by the way, when I interviewed Dr. Ozacchini, this was it was April of 2018. This was COVID wasn't even talked about yet. But then obviously we put the film together, and everything changed.
Yeah, one of the things I also remembered, I watched, like, it was because of the Spanish flu, and there was a documentary I watched in 2019, and they said, okay, well, 100 years ago, and so we hope there's not another pandemic. And the next year it happened. So
crazy. Yeah, just crazy.
Quite stunning. Wonderful documentary. I highly recommend it. It's Syndrome K. Stephen Edwards, you're the composer and the director of the film. Thank you very much for this wonderful documentary, and I recommend everyone to watch it. It's a lesson in history, and it shows us heroic bravery here. People who risk their lives to help others. I mean, that's just wonderful, and a big thank you to these 3 doctors and everybody else who did this, who took those steps to save others.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being on Rash's World, and look forward to the movie.
Thanks, Rash, so much. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.